Good evening, guys. It is Tuesday, February 4th, 2025. This Bathrobe business. I have no coffee tonight, but I still have the news. So pretty big day, a lot of different earnings coming out. And then one major story I'm going to talk about that may be the end of American democracy and life as we know it. So fun times. Okay, first story I'm going to jump into is just going to be mentioned in passing. Gold hit another all-time high. Let me share my screen with you guys. Okay. Gold is currently at 2881. I know we called Goldman Sachs said gold would hit 3,000 before the end of the year. I predicted it would probably be before the end of the first quarter, and it's definitely on track to do that. So it's hit an all-time record once again. Remember, these numbers are higher than gold has ever been, not just adjusted for inflation, not just nominally, but all time. Not during the Carter administration, not during the years of Volcker, none of those years compared to the price of gold of what it is today. So we are entering every day new and new uncharted territory. Now, this is, again, in response to the tariffs, or so they say. Gold is a complex market. China is also a big component of this, as China purchases a lot of gold. And as well as other countries, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran. A lot of these countries flock to gold as a reserve currency. No, I shouldn't say reserve currency, as a balance into their currency. And so this is probably going to be increasing here in the next quarter, year to come. So keep an eye on that. Now, let's jump into the stories of the day. So Alphabet shares drop as much as 9% on revenue miss, soaring AI investment. So let's share the numbers first. So revenue fell. Revenue did not fall. Revenue fell below expectations. So revenue was at 96.47 billion versus 96.56 billion. So they came in slightly below what earnings were anticipated. They came in at $2.15 versus $2.13 expected. Their YouTube advertising did outpace what expectations were. However, their cloud service, and this is one of the biggest contributors, fell below expectations as well at 11.96 billion versus the 12.19 anticipated. So this is another company that has seen massive realignment this week as earnings are coming out. We've seen this happen with almost every company we've talked about, everything from NVIDIA, Microsoft, now Alphabet, Google. The only one that was the saving grace was Meta, but that was because they had incredibly strong ad data. Especially with the DeepSeek on the horizon, and now all these companies showing that they're making these massive investments into AI, which several years in just aren't yielding the income that everybody thought they would. It's finally starting to burst. So I think we're going to continue to see drops in revenues of a lot of these companies, because now finally the emperor has no clothes. We see what's going on. We see that AI doesn't deserve this kind of investment, and it doesn't yield the type of returns that we were promised 2-3 years ago. So I think this is definitely going to continue. Now, to counter that point, AMD is doing actually very well. Now, their profits, the stock fell in after hours trading for what I believe is a silly reason. So let's start with the numbers first. So earnings per share. They had $1.09 earnings per share versus an anticipated $1.08. Revenues came in at 7.66 billion versus 7.53 billion. Where the miss occurred was AMD reported that 3.86 billion in data center sales, and the market was anticipating around 4.14. However, that 3.86 is up 69% from a year-over-year basis. So I honestly think that the market had very unrealistic expectations. Now, why I think AMD is in a stronger position than something like NVIDIA is because they don't have as much market share, and so therefore they have more room for growth. NVIDIA is the name in AI, and so because of that, their growth was factored into the stock price. Their current structure was factored into the stock price. So when DeepSeek came out and all these revelations happened about maybe you don't need as much power as we have been told, there was a huge collapse because everything was built on NVIDIA constantly growing and growing and growing. Now, in AMD doesn't compete directly, it does actually compete directly with NVIDIA and AI, but then it competes with traditional chip manufacturers like Intel, and they have traditional data centers. So their data center supply is growing, not just in AI, but in traditional cloud computing and everything else we've been come to be used to. And they're not just taking market share from NVIDIA, but also from Intel. So that's why I believe that AMD is actually a buy. I think they're a strong investment. They're seeing strong growth, and they have more room to grow because they're not as heavily reliant on AI, and they have so much less market share than the leader, which is NVIDIA. So I would say that on the pullback, I think that AMD is a strong buy. So I would definitely recommend that. I'm probably going to incorporate that into my portfolio at some point. Next story I want to talk about is Nissan and Honda. So a few months ago, we reported that Nissan and Honda were planning a merger. This would essentially make them the world's third largest automotive manufacturer. However, today that may be on shaky ground. So this isn't official. This is mostly from a newspaper that was published in Japan saying that Nissan is not happy with the agreement of the merger. Specifically, I guess with this merger, as it's been described so far, Nissan would become a subsidiary of Honda. According to the report that came out in this newspaper, Nissan is not happy with that, and they're wanting to back out. I still think this merger is going to happen simply because Nissan really needs this. So to give you a quick stat, Nissan, their operating profits fell by 90%, and net income declined 94% in the first fiscal half of 2024. They are having serious issues with the US market, especially in the face of EVs. They are phasing out entire lines. Like, for example, my car, the Infiniti Q50, I love the car, but it actually blew an engine this year, and I had to pay for an engine replacement. That was actually a story I covered on this channel. And their sales are declining across the board. So NVIDIA definitely needs this because as they are being outpaced and squeezed out of the market by EVs, they have no way of holding on to whatever market share they have, not to mention the issues they do have with their engines and their reliability. Honda can still survive. Honda probably needs market share, and they probably need manufacturing capacity to compete in the EV market. But Honda is touted and well known as a reliable automaker. Their sales probably not what they used to be, but they're still very strong. So I think this merger is still going to happen one way or another. As I've talked about on this channel before, I think EVs are greatly going to change the market in the next 10 years. Their prices are definitely going to come down, but there's going to be a lot of consolidation. There's going to be a lot of commoditization of the idea of what a car is. And the old school models of performance and features kind of start going out the window because it's becoming much more standardized. Same thing with what happened with phones. There used to be dozens of manufacturers on the market. I was actually talking to my fiance about this a couple of days ago, that we used to have so many different kinds of flip phones. There were Razors, there were Sidekicks, there were the old Nokia blocks. There were tons and tons of different phones, and everybody would show off the different phones they had, the different cases they had, etc. However, once everything became standardized with the smartphone, you didn't really need as many lines as you did. Now, part of that is also monopolistic practices by the big two, which is Apple and Google, the App Store, et cetera, et cetera. But part of it is just market forces. And I would say that the market forces probably play a bigger role than you anticipate. So I think the same thing is going to happen with cars, that they're going to start merging, consolidating, defining themselves in weird ways. So like that, what Jaguar did a few months ago, I wouldn't buy one, but it's clear that that is probably the right maneuver to take in the face of EV. Not necessarily the concept correct, but the whole rebranding, restructuring of the company is probably the right direction to take. Time will show if it will yield profit, but I think it's definitely forward thinking and understanding that the current car market is changing. This is a major revolution, a revolution the likes of which we haven't seen since the development of the assembly line. So we'll see what happens with it. I guess I will get to, well, no, I'll share these last two stories since we're talking about cars. GM cuts about 50% of the Cruise staff after ending robotaxi business. So I was not aware of this segment of GM, but apparently GM did have a robotaxi line, and apparently they've already spent 10 billion on it since 2016 when they acquired it. So this is essentially more or less a Waymo competitor. But they are shutting it down. And they are shuffling off half the staff and then firing the other half. It doesn't seem like it's going to be profitable. And I think this is foretelling of what's going to happen with Tesla. Tesla is trying to keep their stock afloat by promising robotaxis. But here we have General Motors that's been at it for the last, 9 years, almost 10 years, and spending about 1.2 billion a year and still not able to crack it. Now, I know people will say, well, Tesla's different. They're more startup culture, maybe. But Tesla hasn't been a startup in a very long time. And I think the only way you could make this work, I think, is with a startup. I don't think an existing established business can afford to invest massive amounts of funds into something that is still very much a gamble. And I don't think Tesla is young enough to attempt that anymore. I don't think it's going to go the way that Tesla anticipates. Now, it doesn't really matter because Musk uses it as a red herring to boost his stock price. He just throws it out there so that people will be inquired and continue investment. But I don't think that it's going to yield the results that he anticipates. Okay. I'm going to jump finally into the main headline story of the day, and that's going to be crypto. So there's two stories that relate to this. So David Sachs, who is Trump's crypto czar, you might have seen him on the All In podcast. I think he's left. Podcast I listen to frequently. I believe he's left that podcast because he took on this position. But he is the crypto czar for the Trump administration, and he is essentially laying out regulatory framework for cryptocurrency, specifically stable coins. This doesn't really apply to Bitcoin per se, because stable coins, they're not necessarily traditional blockchain currency like crypto that is not tied directly to an asset, but a stable coin could be tied to gold. It could be tied to oil. In this scenario that comes up in this article multiple times, interestingly enough, is the US dollar. So stable coins that are tied to something more or less tangible. At the same time, related story is that Musk is attacking the Treasury, saying that I'll just read it verbatim. Elon Musk has deeply embedded. Musk, the Tesla billionaire turned governor, cost-cutting, is leading the Doge Department for Government Efficiency, proposed by Trump Commerce Department nominee Howard Lutnick. Musk has confirmed he wants to put the U.S. Treasury on a blockchain, the technology that underpins Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, including Musk's pet project Doge. So between these two articles, it's kind of scary. So why this is scary? This is where it can kind of get complicated, but essentially they're attempting a CBDC, a central bank digital currency. It may or may not be blockchain based, but that doesn't really matter because given these two stories, we see that the administration is coming at this from two sides. They want the Treasury Department to be backed by a blockchain, and they want regulatory control of that blockchain. Why this is dangerous? So CBDCs are kind of horrible. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to sound conspiratorial. But it doesn't make it any less true. And it doesn't mean that it won't one day come into fruition. Let's not forget that 5 years ago, the entire world locked down in a way that is unprecedented. It's something that would have been a conspiracy theory 6 years ago. It's something that you would have heard Alex Jones say, and you would have said, that's insane. Come on. What are you talking about? They're not going to lock us in our house for years, except that's exactly what they did. So that's why I use this as a preface. And I will also like you to refer to an amazing journalist, Whitney Webb. Whitney Webb has done amazing investigative journalism on multiple stories, not to mention she's probably done the most in-depth analysis of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Everybody talks about Jeffrey Epstein's sex scandal. And of course, that's salacious and tantalizing, and everybody wants to talk about it. And Clinton and Bush and every celebrity you can think of was there on the island. But that's not really the big story. If anything, that detracts from the big story. A lot of these guys were giving Epstein millions and at times billions of dollars. Like, what was it? Wasn't it one major hedge fund? There was a major hedge fund that gave him almost like $750 million. It was some ridiculous number like that for essentially, I'm not just going to call it money laundering, but it was financial manipulation. So all these people were using Epstein not for sex. This wasn't a pimp or a pimping organization. That may have been a component of it, but it was major financial crimes. It was major money laundering. It was major currency manipulation. That's what Jeffrey Epstein was really doing for all of these incredibly rich and powerful people. And Whitney Webb has done an amazing job of documenting that. She brings the receipts with everything. And she pretty much predicted this. It's got to be at least 2 years ago. She started talking about how crypto is going to become standardized and going to become regulated by companies like BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, etc. And about a year later, we got the Bitcoin ETF. Then she talked about how governments definitely want to have CBDCs because it is one of the best ways to control not only their own funds, but the funds of individuals. It becomes easier for tax regulation. It becomes easier in implementing regulation on any certain purchase or acquisition, because now you have programmable currency. So I will give you a synopsis and a possible scenario of why CBDCs are bad, but really just listen to Whitney Webb. She just recently did a new interview. I'm not even all the way through it. I started listening today on Tom Bilyeu's podcast. I believe it's the Impact podcast is what it's called, but I just call it the Tom Bilyeu podcast. But she was on there, I believe, just either yesterday or today, talking about this very story before this actually broke. So refer to her because she will give you a better analysis than I ever can. But CBDCs are horrible because since the United States has left the gold standard, it essentially has divorced you from controlling your money because the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government now control currency. They can print as much as they want. They can take away as much as they want. They can do any sort of financial manipulation they want. Up until that point, when there was a gold standard and there was gold-backed securities, they couldn't because they were limited. They were handcuffed because the U.S. government didn't actually control currency. They could only match currency. So since the 1970s, when Nixon went off the gold standard, we have been in a progressive system of us having less and less control of our money. Because now money isn't an intangible thing. Money is something that is issued by the government. And that's very, very different than the structure of what money is supposed to be. Now enter CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. The US government will now have full control and full ledgers of every single transaction you do. They will know who you pay, when you pay, how much you pay. From a tax standpoint, they will be able to squeeze blood from a stone because they will know every single little thing that you do. But also from a regulatory standpoint, they will be able to have a currency that they can program that can be used in certain areas and cannot be used in certain areas. So for example, right now, if I want to go out and buy something, I can whip out my credit card and pay for it. However, if, for example, we are in a lockdown, again, let's pretend that this is COVID 2.0. Tomorrow it's coronavirus 2025, and we go into lockdown. Now, in lockdown, you can actually program currency so that I can't buy non-essential goods. So let's say we're in a lockdown and I go to a grocery store and I want to buy something. And they say, well, wait, hold on a second. You're only supposed to be leaving the store for bare essential minimums. But here you are at Walmart buying DVDs. No, that's not allowed. You can't buy those. Your currency will go towards groceries, but not towards this. And it will be locked down at the individual currency level. I know that sounds conspiratorial, but that's not crazy, especially when you consider that Meg Whitmer had these types of regulations in a very archaic way during lockdown. So I believe she's the governor of Michigan, Michigan or Minnesota. It's one of those M states in the Midwest. Sorry, I apologize. Y'all look and sound the same. But during lockdown, she restricted grocery stores and Walmarts to block off certain areas that were deemed non-essential. So you couldn't spend your money how you wanted to. You had to spend the money the way the federal government wanted you to. However, alcohol was still allowed to be sold, as well as I believe in her state, marijuana is legal for sale as well, and that was allowed as well. Now, this can get even muddier because what happens tomorrow when we're going to have stricter, because Trump's only in here for 4 years, the next administration comes in and they decide that we're rejoining the Paris Accords, and you know what? We're not doing enough. So we need to regulate carbon on an individual basis. So the transactions you do on a daily basis can be programmed to lower the carbon footprint of each individual person. So that means the stuff you buy or don't buy can be regulated for as a carbon tax. I know that sounds crazy, but that's very possible with CBDCs. And even if it doesn't happen today, even if it doesn't happen within the next 10 years, the next 20 years, it could happen within the next 30, 40, 50, 60 years, but eventually it will happen. Because once you give the government a new instrument of war, which is essentially what this is, they're going to use it. Let's not forget that the federal income tax originally was a wealth tax. You, the listener, right now probably should not have been paying income tax. It was originally passed during the Gilded Age to control wealth and to control the upper middle class in order to curb corruption. But sooner or later, and at the time it was only a few percentage points, but slowly that began to creep up, and slowly the US government needed more and more money. So that little income tax began to expand to the upper middle class, and then the middle class, and then every sector of the US economy. So now, at this point, you don't even question it. And the same thing will happen if a CBDC is passed. One way or another, it is you losing control over your currency. And it is also going to force people to have less and less cash transactions. Everything is going to be digital, and the government is going to try to steal and document every single dollar that comes out of your pocket. Now, these two stories seem like, oh, they're innocent enough, but in conjecture, this is exactly what Whitney Webb has been talking about for years. And before you say, well, you're just taking the opinion of one individual, no. Whitney Webb goes in depth on these investigations, and she pulls articles from companies like BlackRock, the World Economic Forum, Davos. She pulls it from everywhere and gets all this information and brings her receipts with every one of these podcasts that she does. So I strongly encourage you to look at it, because the CBDC is not a joke. This is something that is very, very, very dangerous. And this, if anything, is the worst thing Trump has ever done, and will probably be the worst thing he will ever do. This is a major, major concern, and you should be very afraid and try to fight it as much as humanly possible, because this is freedom. This isn't just individual freedom. This is financial freedom. This is the ability for you to spend money how you want, when you want. This is the very foundation of what capitalism is. So if you look behind me, that flag, that communist flag, that is not a joke. Nobody thought that communism would happen in the Soviet Union in 1918, but then 6 months later at the October Revolution, it did. So you should be very concerned with this. So that's pretty much it. I don't mean to leave it all doom and gloom, but I think it's a very major point. So I hope you guys have a productive Wednesday. Fight CBDCs, and I'll see you tomorrow evening.